So this next unit we're going to be doing is based in experimentation and then the history of psychology. So I want to start out by reviewing a little bit the concept of the scientific method. Now, scientific method is probably something you're familiar with from other science classes that you've taken. And so hopefully this is just a little bit of review, but one of the things we're going to spend the next little bit doing is looking at some famous experiments from psychology. So I wanted to make sure that you were familiar with this. Also, one of the things you're going to do in this unit is design your own experiment using these steps. So just like I said, just wanted to give you a little review in what the scientific method was. Got a flow chart here for you, something you could easily find online, but it just kind of basically breaks down the parts of the scientific method. All scientific inquiry starts with a question. So somebody just sitting around saying, I wonder if. With psychology, usually it's something based in human behavior. And we'll see that with a couple of the famous experiments we're going to look at, is people just kind of saying, okay, well, this is the conventional wisdom, but does that actually hold true? So what you do is you do a little background research, and then you construct what's called a hypothesis. So the hypothesis is what you think is going to happen in the experiment. You do the experiment, and then you kind of look and say, was I right or was I wrong? Now, the important thing to remember in the scientific method is even if you're wrong, even if that hypothesis is proved to be not true, you've still learned something. And so there's no kind of shame in performing an experiment and things turning out differently than the way that you thought they would. So I got a couple of sample research questions here for you. How good are people at detecting lies? I think most of us would say we're pretty good at telling when somebody's lying to us. Psychological research says we really don't have a clue. And so that may be one. Does social networking make people more or less likely to interact with people in real life? This is kind of a growing field in psychology as social media, smartphones, things like that become more prevalent in our society. It's only natural that people ask, what kind of effect do those things have on human behavior? Does our appearance impact how people respond to us? So is there such a thing as dressing for success? And so those are just the kind of questions that can be the start of some type of scientific inquiry. And so what you do is you have to turn those questions, though, into a hypothesis. And so the hypothesis, if you look at that word right, we got thesis there. Hopefully we don't have anybody from English class that's going to have writing PTSD or anything like that. The hypothesis is just your statement of what you think is going to happen. So you have to take an angle. So let's see, women are better at detecting lies than men. So we've taken that initial question we were asking, we've taken a position on it, and that is a testable hypothesis. Joggers will run faster when other people are present. Again, something we could test. Job seekers with facial piercings are less likely to be given job applications. Again, that is taking a very specific kind of slant on that question we were asking, and now that is something that we could design an experiment for. I remember several years ago I had a group of students do this type of experiment. They picked 4 or 5 businesses here in town, and they picked 3 of their group members to go in at different times asking for job applications. And the first student went in very well dressed. I think it was a young man, even wearing a tie, button-down shirt, and asked if there were jobs in the company. Did those at 4 places. We sent somebody in dressed in just kind of a regular high school kid, jeans and t-shirt kind of outfit, and then we sent somebody in dressed in the goth style that was big back at that point, and so went in that. And so when we came back and kind of compared notes, The young man with the tie got applications at all 4 or 5 places. He even had one place call him back. He wasn't even looking for a job, but just calling to see if he was going to turn the application in. About 80% of the businesses gave the young man in the just kind of regular high school attire an application. But surprisingly, the fellow that went in the golf stuff, nobody was hiring. And so that's an example of how maybe you could test something that's like this. One little tip I want to give you about hypotheses, and this will be something that could carry you through in some different classes. It's much easier to kind of perform the next step that we've got to do if you make them into what are called if and then statements. Because what we're going to do is we're going to break them down into variables, right? So when we do if and then, the if part is the independent variable in our experiment, and the then part becomes the dependent variable. And that's kind of the next thing we've got to do, is be able to break down which part is dealing with which. So let's take this first one here. If the subject is a woman, then they're better at detecting lies. So the if part tells us the independent variable there is gender. The dependent variable is going to be their success rate at detecting the lies. If a job seeker has facial piercings, then they're less likely to be given a job application. So our independent variable is the presence or lack of facial piercings. And so just kind of a way of being able to define those things. The independent variable is always the if part. So the I, independent, I and if, and then the dependent variable is the then part. So the independent variable is what you as an experimenter will change in an experiment. The then is what happens because of it, right? So it's kind of a cause and effect. The then part becomes the effect that had. There are several different ways you can conduct scientific research. I've got some listed for you here. When you're looking to do this, probably the easiest thing to do is to do naturalistic observation. You're not having to bring anybody into a laboratory. You're not having to set up anything elaborate. You just kind of sit back and look and see what's going on. I had a group of students once that was very interested in seeing what type of person returned their carts at Walmart most frequently, and so they just kind of had to sit out in the parking lot and see who was what type of person was coming in and putting their carts in those little cart caddies that some people use. Case study method could be used if you can't talk to somebody. Say you had a theory about serial killers or something like that. Obviously you don't want to spend any kind of great amount of time with those people, and so you could do case studies that way. Pretty common ways to do surveys. Ask people questions. Now the thing with the surveys, you got to make sure that you're kind of disguising what it is that you want to find out, because we as human beings have a tendency to try to make ourselves look better, and so we may look for the right answer instead of the answer that is actually what we would give in those types of situations. Longitudinal studies are ones that go across a long period of time. You're actually going to have an article that you're going to read for our Tuesday Actively Learn articles that's going to deal with that. And then we have cross-sectional studies where you pull out a certain portion of the population and you just look at them. So if we were going to say, do athletes make better grades, right? We look at the GPA of the whole school, but then we pull out the athletes as part of that. So it's just kind of pulling a particular group of people out. When you're looking at people to do experiments on, you want to make sure that your subjects give you a random, so you don't just handpick people, and representative sample of who you're looking for, right? So if we were to take that last question I asked, do athletes make better grades? We don't just want to take basketball players, right? Because that's just one type of athlete. You'd want to get athletes from a lot of different sports that are doing, and then look at their GPAs. But subjects, using humans for subject in scientific experimentation has gotten really controversial. And what we're going to see with a lot of the experiments we're going to look at are some of the reasons why that's happened. That little guy here actually was born because of scientific research. His dad wanted to perform it. He had a theory about when babies start to identify voices. Applied for permission to use children in experiment, couldn't get it, and so he said, you know what, I'll just have my own test subject. Now I'm not sure how he felt about later on being the little fella, that the reason you were born was your dad wanted to do an experiment, but I guess at least you were born, right? So like I said, over the next couple of these sessions, we're going to take a look at 6 really famous experiments in psychological history. May even slide a 7th or 8th in there too, to help illustrate some of these points, but hopefully that makes a little sense to you as far as the scientific method goes.